we've hit our quorum. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm David Verrill, Executive Director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. We have a dear friend joining us today for our seminar. Sonny Tambe is presenting a paper on remote work and the diversity of the labor pool from his work with some technology startups. I think we'll kind of let the Q&A flow. If you want to interrupt with a question, feel free to raise your hand, or if you feel more comfortable putting your question into chat, then either Emma or Hong Yi will aggregate those and prioritize them for Q&A session. Sonny is Associate Professor in the Operations, Information, and Decisions group at the Wharton School, a son of MIT, and we're so pleased to have him here presenting today. Sonny, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro. Appreciate it. Let me just make sure everyone hear me okay?
Yes. Gotcha.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure I wasn't on mute or anything. Okay, so thanks so much for having me. Look forward to your feedback. This is pretty new work, so please feel free to jump in. This is, we're talking a little bit before. Remote work obviously is a topic that people, by and large, a lot of people have thoughts on, and so look forward to hearing what you think. Any suggestions for us as we get going with this research. So as David mentioned, this paper is looking at the relationship between remote work and the kind of applicants you get, the labor pool, when you're posting or looking for talent. We're going to be looking at technology startups specifically. This is just a slide to remind myself, to remind you, because in the academic world we sort of think about these things broadly from a market perspective. Just as a reminder, and I think people know this, but this is actually a really difficult challenge right now for managers, in the sense that it's something managers are really struggling with, thinking about what to do with the remote/hybrid work decision. And when they think about this, there's obviously a lot of factors at play. One of them is productivity. Are workers as productive when they're remote as they are when they're on site? And then there's another issue at play here, which is retention, which is that if I choose to bring workers on site or force workers to come on site, am I going to lose a bunch of my workers, my skilled workers that are hard to replace? And so from a management perspective, there's a lot of folks that are struggling with the question of do I bring workers back? Do I require them to come back? Do I do it hybrid? And if I do it hybrid, how do I structure that? How do I think about on-site days versus off-site days? This is a problem many places, as we were discussing slightly earlier. Here at Penn, it's been a challenge, certainly across the university, across the schools, trying to figure out what the right balance is with students, with faculty, and so on, trying to get everyone back. So that's sort of the framing, thinking about what it is, how managers should be thinking about remote work here. So the motivating question really is, as this, and this is an open question, I guess, but it seems like remote work isn't a one-off. It appears to be hardening, perhaps into a permanent fixture, at least in many sectors of what modern work perhaps is going to look like. This has been enough of a shock to the system to perhaps become something longstanding in our work environment. We want to look at one particular aspect of this, which is as a manager, as you're thinking about what it means to take work remote, what that does to diversity in the application pool. And we're going to look at diversity along three dimensions here: gender, race, and experience. I'm not 100% convinced yet they belong in the same paper. Right now, we sort of are looking at all of them because we don't know exactly which ones we want to focus on, but I'll talk about all three today. And we're, again, particularly interested in the question, the decision point of what it means to take on-site jobs remote. A couple of caveats and comments before I get started here. This is not, we're going to show some relation to show the association between remote work and the kind of applicants you get. We're not going to be able to say whether remote work is desirable. Of course, you know, if it's the case that remote work ends up drawing in a lot of female applicants, for instance, that may not necessarily be a good thing, because remote jobs come with their own challenges, right? And there's a lot of concern about remote work and what it means from a career concerns perspective, what it means from a productivity perspective, promotion perspective, and so on. Of course, also, does it place jobs on the road to offshoring? So there's a caveat here, which isn't to say that if the remote work is a good in that sense. Our sample is going to be focused on technical labor markets, which I think is an interesting labor market, an important one. Diversity, of course, is a particular problem in this market. There's a rapidly growing body of work, some of which is done by people here on causes and consequences of remote work. It's rapidly growing here. I'm not going to review this all, but it is some of this is in the paper. And if we're, you know, if anyone has suggestions of other literatures and papers we should be linking to, please do share that. We're in the process of putting all that together. Okay, so and I'm going to talk about the data in a second here, but we're going to be focusing on three variables. And I just added this slide just to kind of inform the empirical analysis. If we think about what to expect, you know, there's some literature on in some aspects of this, but not all. There's a fairly robust literature that argues that women tend to place greater value on job flexibility and have higher commute costs. That literature is fairly robust. For URM candidates, there's a little bit less to work with here. There is a literature that argues that candidates in particular race groups have stronger geographic preferences. This mostly comes out of the literature on immigration. Again, if anyone has recommendations or suggestions on literatures to link to here, that would be helpful. And then, as we were talking about earlier today, it seems more and more like less experienced workers require higher bandwidth interactions, both for tacit knowledge accumulation and early career growth. So these are kind of the literatures we're linking to or thinking about as we're putting together or structuring this analysis and thinking about what we should expect to see when you make a job remote. Okay, so let me talk about the data. The data are pretty interesting, and I think for many of you would be you'll get your head around it pretty quickly because you work on data that's similar in many respects. So the data in this case are from AngelList Talent, and AngelList, for those of you who don't know, is a platform that focuses on startups. It has a pretty well-known footprint in this area, and for historical reasons, I would argue that maybe most of the interesting activity for technology startups on the labor market side goes through this platform, more so than other large labor market platforms. And the reason is because there's a few reasons for this. One of them is that AngelList was also at one point a place where venture capitalists found startups. And so there was just sort of a multi-way market here that created a lot of gravity. So a lot of these tech startups that were looking for talent, looking for money, ended up going to this platform. And still to this day, I think the lion's share of what happens when you're looking for jobs or posting jobs for this particular sector, a lot of it goes through AngelList Talent. One of the nice things here is that we have activity from both sides of the market. And so for those of you who work with this kind of data, know that that's interesting for various reasons, but we have both what the startups are doing, how they're posting at a pretty granular level, but also what the applicants are doing, right? So their job search activity and what they choose to post to. And so many of you have worked with market data. One of the interesting things here is it has supply and demand activity, but it's for a full-time job market. Right. This is not for a part-time job market or for project work. It is for the full-time market for this particular ecosystem, which is startups. So the kinds of jobs you tend to see here mostly are there's technical jobs, certainly like machine learning engineers. There's also jobs like product management or marketing analytics jobs, sort of tech adjacent jobs. The platform also requires and has always required for historical reasons companies to indicate remote status on their jobs. So we're not needing to, in this case, sort of data mine or try to infer what jobs are remote or could be remote. They have to be explicit about it. And historically, they've always had to be explicit about it. And the platform collects demographic information for various job applicants. Okay, and so we have listing and application data for a long time, since pretty much the beginning of this kind of platform activity. It's a huge amount of data, and we're talking about 100 million job applications or plus, right, over the 12-year sample. It's all for this paper. I'm only somewhat arbitrarily looking at the last 4 years or so, just to give enough of a window of what was going on before the pandemic closures and what's happening afterwards. But the data are there to go back earlier if that's useful for us for any reason. So what this is going to allow us to do is to analyze how applicant composition changes as startups were forced to change jobs remote. I want to set expectations here a little bit. We're not going to rely too heavily on the pandemic closures as any key part of the research design, partly because it's really hard to work with. So what we're doing right now is fairly simple in terms of comparisons. We'll get to that. But we are going to be looking at kind of before and after in a limited sense. And finally, just to note, so employers in the sample, I forget if I have the statistics in here. I think I have some. They're a fairly limited set, but they represent a well-defined ecosystem. So so you should be thinking about this in tech startups. When I say startups, what I mean is anything from, say, really 2 MBAs and an idea, ranging all the way up till maybe Slack or Twilio, who are also posting. So it's not the big tech firms, but they're sort of up to medium-sized firms, especially the firms that started on this platform when they were smaller and continue to post here later on. Let me stop here and make sure or see if there's any questions about the data structure or setup before I move on. Okay. All right, so feel free to, if anything's unclear, feel free to.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Are there applications they can get outside of this data set, AngelList?
So are even the list,
Like,
the listings?
Is this like a complete list of all of their applications, or
Actually, no.
This
This is strictly within platform. This is strictly within platform. So it's strictly the applications. And so, I'm glad you brought that up. So let me sort of just circumscribe here a little bit what we can see and what we can't see. So we can't go too far. So we can see these startups posting. We can see that the applications, and you'll see in a minute, it's a pretty large number. You can see the applications that these postings are received. You can see it in a granular way. So kind of over time, week by week or minute by minute, whatever. We can see a little bit about how the employer also has a mechanism to basically indicate whether they like the application. So we don't see further down the hiring funnel, we don't see who's hired, and we don't necessarily see who's interviewed. So the limit of what we can see is essentially kind of this, maybe some two-way information about the applicant has submitted an application. The employer basically says, this is one of my top applicants. And that's sort of the extent of what we see in this. It's only for the applications that are submitted through AngelList. All right. Okay, so I think we move on to, here's a little bit about the data. This is, it's a well-trafficked system. We're seeing a lot of applications per listing, very skewed. So let me provide some texture to these numbers. So we're seeing about 90 apps per listing. About 20% of those, a little bit less, are from women. And again, these are self-reported demographic variables, by the way. So when they join the site, they kind of represent. Now, let me explain this number here for URM maps because it's a little bit tricky. And so it's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit tricky because not everybody chooses to report their race. And because of that, the denominator is smaller. So it turns out that about 20% of candidates are also fall into that URM category. So even though this number is much smaller, you can think about this as being sort of a smaller denominator, because a smaller fraction of these total applications are actually reporting their race. So whatever that turns out to be. So there's about maybe a third of them or so report race. So this ends up being about 20%, 20% as well. As you can see from their salary numbers, we're talking about a high skill group here. Certainly in the last few years, as you know, salaries have been quite high in the sector. Again, these are for mostly for tech and you'd argue frontier tech, companies at the cutting edge of VR and AR and AI and those kinds of technologies that require engineers who are relatively specialized to be able to do this kind of work. We have, in this sample that I created, we have about, I don't know, most of it's after these pandemic-induced closures, but that's arbitrary. We can control that. And about in the aggregate sample, about 27% has gone remote. I'll show you some data on that.
Sorry, Sonny, I have a quick question about the URM apps. Is there like good literature out there in terms of like the directionality of self-reporting and the biases involved in both the denominator and the numerator? Like, are you more likely to sort of report if you're URM or less likely to report, and then vice versa, right? I feel like there could be quite a few.
I think that's a good point. I think I don't know the answer to that question, and I'd love to know the answer to that question. So I need to go looking on what we should expect to see. Yeah.
This is not exactly relevant to that, but I would I'm definitely be interested in that. One thing that is sort of related, barely, is that there was something that showed that, like with emojis, when they added the skin toned emojis, white people don't use it. Like they always use the yellow one, always. You're much less likely to use a skin toned emoji. So I would definitely be interested in if that is similar across races.
Yeah, I think I would be. I mean, I suspect that's right, that you are going to see some groups underuse or underreport those kinds of indicators. I don't know what the
and you don't have name data, right? That's not available to you, right?
Or sort of yes, sort of no. And so we kind of do, and it's a little complicated. I won't get into it here, but we kind of do have a fairly large sample where we can cross check. And I have run the names through like Prism type packages and things like that generate race, and that has other kinds of reporting error. But we can sort of create a cross tab or something between what they're self-reporting and what their names are indicating for gender and for that. Yeah, that's right. It's not exactly the same sample, but it's overlapping. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good. I should do that. Okay. So let's get into the data a little bit. So here's the move to remote work in the data. This is just the job listing side. So what I'm showing on the x-axis here, the y-axis, is the fraction of job listings that are posted that are indicated as remote. On the x-axis here is the number of weeks since closures. For closures, I'm choosing so closures, I'm talking about, of course, the pandemic-induced closures. And I'm using the date here, March 15th, 2020. And the reason I'm using this date for now is because this is the date which I think Gavin Newsom put shelter-in-place orders around San Francisco and Silicon Valley. So, a little bit different in all different places. And this sample, by the way, I didn't mention, this is an international. So the platform itself is fairly international. There's a lot of activity in places like London, where the venture capital community is big. I've limited it here to the US in terms of what we're looking at. So this is a US-based sample only. So March 15th is this orange line. As we can see here, of course, the numbers start to rise pretty significantly. There's a baseline of about 20% or so, a little bit less for jobs that were listed as remote before these pandemic-induced closures. It shoots up to about 80% over the following maybe 2 years or so. So this is pretty recent data. It kind of goes up immediately, of course, because it has to after the closures. It dips down a little bit. You might remember there was this period where I think the initial wave rolled through and people were feeling pretty optimistic before the Delta variant showed up. And so I think these listings kind of dropped down again. and then sprung back up and kind of, at least for now, seem to have stayed at that level for a while. So this gets to about 80% remote from 20% remote over the course of the sample. So which jobs went remote first? So this is a heat map, and on the x-axis, we kind of have broad job categories: design, engineering, management, marketing, ops, product, and sales. And on the y-axis of each of these, we have wage buckets. And so what this is basically indicating is that, and so as you get lighter in this picture, as the cell gets lighter, that means more jobs in that cell are remote. And so, of course, there's a secular increase before and after the pandemic closures, which is not surprising. I think other things this is showing, none of which are terribly surprising, but I think the highest paid jobs are those that have that were the last. That's a lot of those are in senior management. I'm not sure if you want to draw any inferences across the job categories here, but management and ops, and to some degree marketing, were less likely to go remote. There's a lot of nuance in here. We also have very fine-grained job titles and job roles, and I'm not showing that here. Once you get into that, there's some interesting differences. For instance, people working on silicon, working in hardware, of course, were less likely to go remote than those working in software. And we have all that those kinds of differences as well. But I'm not showing them here. So that's just a lot of data. Okay, and this, of course, goes from almost no remote jobs to about 80% remote, which is where we ended up. Okay, so we're going to observe. We observe in general applications shifting to remote jobs. Actually, I had a better picture of this earlier. But actually, this one's enough. What this is basically showing is that, I don't know if you can see it very well. The blue line here is remote listings. It pretty much stays constant. It's not picking up a lot in terms of volume. The on-site listing. So if we're looking at that shift to remote, it's really on this platform, at least, more about the on-site listings disappearing than it is about a huge increase in remote listings. So these are not job listings. These are applications to jobs. And so this is on the y-axis here. This is total applications to these three categories of jobs: remote, on-site, and then all, of course, is just the sum of those two. So the applications all kind of shift towards remote jobs, especially after the closures. Okay, start to get into the different demographic indicators that we're interested in. So in this picture, this is the fraction of URM applications. It is generally higher to remote jobs before the pandemic, before the pandemic closures. The dotted line is remote jobs. The solid line is on-site jobs. We see this gap, and I should put in some error bars or something. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But the gap increases somewhat after the pandemic closures. So it's always higher for URM applicants to remote jobs, but that goes up somewhat after the pandemic closures. For experienced applicants, and this is kind of let me talk about this one for a minute before moving on. One of the things to keep in mind here is that the sample plays a big role. We think about, so we see here that remote applicants are more likely to attract experienced workers. One of the ways to think about this is these are tech workers, right? By and large, these are tech workers, and if you have the sort of stereotypical image of the experienced, maybe cybersecurity expert who wants to work remote jobs. So you have a lot of these types of jobs that are attracting people who are highly skilled and have worked in these kinds of professions for years. So that's kind of what you see here. Of course, as all things go remote, that kind of blends the pool a little bit. So you see less of these differences. It's still the case that remote jobs are attracting more experienced workers, but it's not as pronounced as it is before the closures. And then I wanted to bring that up here in particular because for gender, I think people expect to see a higher fraction of female applicants for remote jobs, but that's not as much the case here because, again, this is tech. And so you have a couple of different things going on here, but a lot of these tech jobs that are remote are ones that attract the fewest female applicants because of the nature of the job or various job confounders here. And so you don't see much of a difference here. A little bit of an increase, a little bit of a change sort of after the pandemic. But so there's actually a widening gap for female applicants towards on-site jobs in this sample after the pandemic. Okay, so those are sort of some descriptives. What we want to do now is kind of just separate out the remote effect. So specifically what we're interested, sort of that those images or pictures were just kind of showing what does the application pool look like to remote jobs and on-site jobs before and after the pandemic. What we'd like to get to is as much as possible a causal statement about if you have a job and you take it remote, what is the impact likely to have on the what is the impact likely to be on the application pool? Of course, with these kinds of pictures, there are lots of challenges here. One of them is that the kinds of jobs that are listed as remote are often fundamentally different than those that are listed on site. So we want to be able to account for those differences when we make this kind of inference. So remote jobs, of course, vary in a bunch of important ways. We don't have any within listing variation here, right? We don't have jobs that are listed as on-site and then become remote, or jobs that are listed as remote and become on-site. What we try to do here, we're trying to keep it simple at the moment. The pandemic shock is very complicated to work with, in my view, for both the supply and demand sides of the market for a number of reasons. What we try to do here is something quite simple, is that we're going to basically match listings based on a few different factors, including job title, compensation, which includes wage and equity, and as in some of our analyses, also the week of posting, of course, employer and location. We include fixed effects for those. So we match on job title and compensation, and include fixed effects for week of posting, employer, and location. And so this is what we're going to do to try to understand what it means for a given job to take it remote. And the reason we're interested in that, of course, is because that is much of the managerial decision point right now, is that I have a job that I'm thinking about making remote, or that I'm converting from on-site to remote, or that I'm converting from remote to on-site. What does it imply for the kinds of applicants I'm likely to get when I also have concerns I'm trying to satisfy and think about when it comes to the composition of the workforce, the kinds of people I'm trying to hire, and so on. So the job listing is going to be the unit of analysis. We'll create a match sample of the listings, and then basically look at this kind of a specification within the match sample, looking at female applications, URM applications, the experience of the applicant pool, and so on. So it's a relatively straightforward set of, we're going to look at this basically before and after the pandemic, but the idea is to look at how the fraction of applications from women changes when for jobs when they're taken remote, controlling for compensation, week of posting, employer listing, and within the match sample on job title and parts of compensation. This is sort of what the match sample, unbalanced, balanced sample looks like, because we're not matching on a whole bunch of things, and the data are quite large, so we get a pretty good balance across the covariates in the match sample. So here's the results. Here's what we're looking at. So this is essentially the remote coefficient in the match sample. So what this is basically indicating is what does it mean? How does the application pool change when a job is remote as opposed to on-site? Each of these different rows in these pictures are different samples, and this is just the coefficient estimate on remote, and these dependent variables are in log applications from women, log applications from URM, and log experience, and all of these specifications control for total applications. So it's a compositional variable. All right, so what's the key thing to take away here? So the coefficient estimates here are all robustly positive across these groups for most pre-closure specifications. And so the idea here is that remote jobs are, a job being designated as remote is associated with a higher fraction of applications from women, a higher fraction of applications from URM candidates, and a more experienced labor pool. This is true in the aggregate sample, which includes all 4 years, 2018 to 22. It's also true for women. It's true for the pre-sample, but it's not true for the post. Not true for the post-sample. So in the post-sample, I think what that basically indicates is that a lot of the effects for women from the pre-sample are due to other job characteristics that kind of get wiped out when everything gets taken remote, or many things get taken remote in the post-sample. URM stays remote, although the magnitudes go down a little bit. Experience is pretty consistent across the different samples. So all in all, the basic idea is that there's more diversity in remote jobs, but maybe less than in the pre-closure period. The coefficient estimate roughly equates to about 1 more application from URM candidates or female candidates, 1 to 1.5 more years of applicant experience for remote jobs when compared to on-site jobs. Yeah, question.
So this is very interesting with regards to the first 2 buckets. I think it makes a lot of sense because of the sort of the dampening of selection bias, I guess you could say, because everybody was taken to remote. But what about the experience part? Like, is this because experience dictates which jobs get moved to remote, and therefore it conserves that distributional aspect pre and post COVID?
Yeah, that sounds, I mean, that's it certainly could be. I haven't thought too much about what's going on in the experience bucket yet. But I mean, I think that's right. I think there's a lot more agency from the employer side around experience and remote in terms of what they or a lot more I guess when thinking about retention, when thinking about knowledge spillovers to other workers, I guess experience is a lot more salient. So that makes sense. I think what you're saying about it, that could be the cause of that, certainly.
Because like, I guess if all the jobs were taken to remote,
yeah,
you would also see a damping effect on the experience, right? Like you got more sort of inexperienced workers matching with these more inexperienced listings in some sense. And therefore you just sort of shift the entire population to remote work, right? So you see that going down as well.
Yeah, or if I guess the sample shifts more, yeah, I'll have to think about that. I can probably look into that a little bit because I can look at how quickly the sample shifts. So if there's sort of more extreme sorting by experience in these different buckets, that might drive some of that as well, relative to the demographics. Any more questions before I move on?
Is this matched sample in 2021 to 2022 has a much smaller N in each of the buckets? Is it just that there are fewer jobs posted, or like was there just a hiring slowdown, or is that applications?
Yeah, let's think. No, this should correspond to I'm just trying to think of what the actual so part of it is that when I say 2022, that stops around probably June, because so it's really only a year and a half, and the 2018 and 19 is 2 full years. These numbers should correspond to job listings, but I'm just I'm not sure if it's, I don't think it's a slowdown as much. It might just be the way I constructed the sample in terms of why that N drops.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and it might be partly, but I had to look into that to say that with more confidence. Okay, we can also add in employer and location fixed effects. These are relatively small firms, so adding in employer fixed effects is going to reduced the sample quite significantly. The estimates are fairly robust in the sense that we find generally the same sign and direction for these things for female URM and experience when putting an employer and location fixed effects. But right now we're relegating it to secondary role in the current analysis only because the sample drops so significantly. We can also look at dynamic effects, maybe particularly interesting in the COVID context, because of course things were shifting rapidly and employers were kind of going back and forth when it comes to thinking about what should be on site and what should be remote, but you do see some gradual adjustment in some of these. So what this is basically doing is just kind of running a model which interacts remote with weak, but otherwise it's a similar model. Oops. Okay. So the next thing we do here is look at which markets benefit most from remote work, which seems like it's one of the next questions to be asking here. And we're particularly going to be interested in the URM side. And so what we're doing here is this is just the remote coefficient. It's the same specification as earlier, but we're breaking markets into quintiles according to, for now, a proxy measure of local labor market diversity. All right, so it's basically looking at least diverse local labor markets and most diverse local labor markets, and across the board in levels, there's always a benefit for remote work in terms of the diversity of the application pool, but there's clearly a stronger effect for these markets that are on the left-hand side of this picture, which is those markets that are the least diverse in terms of their local labor markets. So, and those, by the way, so when I say a proxy measure, we can go back, of course, and get the data, and we should get the data on the actual, perhaps, worker composition or workforce composition in these markets. Right now, all we're doing is looking at workers in these markets that are applying to local on-site jobs and using that as a proxy measure for what we're talking about here. These are the markets that are on the left-hand side of this picture that are on the lowest quintile of local market diversity. It's not, it's a diverse group in itself in a sense, because some of these are, of course, as you see, high-tech centers, which are, of course, also known for not being particularly diverse in terms of the local community. But in any case, the idea here is that we're talking about remote work and the implications for the diversity of the application pool, that there's some cities, some markets that seem to benefit much more than others. Yeah, Hong.
Sorry, can you elaborate a bit on like the metric being used here for local market diversity? Is it like a percentage of URM workers in the labor pool?
So on the let me just caveat this a little bit by saying this is actually a very new set of results. That's the first time I'm talking about them. So the measures are a little bit rough. So on the I'm dividing cities into quintiles here by looking at the diversity of the people applying to local jobs, and sorry, people who live in that city, because we have where they live as well, and who are applying to I think it's it's just the diversity of people who live in that city who are on the platform though. It's just those people on the platform that live in that city. That is the measure used to put cities into those quintiles right now. And then
so is it like percentage of workers in Palo Alto who are on the AngelList platform, or wait, percentage of people who are, yeah.
It's a fraction of job seekers on the platform from Palo Alto who are URM candidates.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So, and the ones are the lowest fraction, the fives are the highest fraction. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah.
That's what and I think the data are out there to maybe, do that at the market level, but we haven't attached those data sets yet. But nevertheless, even with these data, there seems to be a pretty clear trend in terms of certainly in the URM category. We could also flip this around and say kind of who are the biggest donor cities, right? And this is sort of what this looks like This is kind of looking at, I need to label this better. This is essentially looking at what cities matter most when contributing URM applicants to other, I'm looking particularly at the lowest or least diverse markets here and looking at where applicants are coming from that are applying to these remote jobs in the least diverse cities. And these are essentially fixed effects from a regression, which looks at that. But the idea is, as you might expect, cities with large URM communities are the ones that are the biggest feeders, the biggest source cities. So what you're seeing basically is a reallocation of talent, of URM talent in particular, from these cities that have rich URM communities to cities where those kinds of communities perhaps don't exist. Okay, a last thing we can do here is look at compensating differentials. Essentially, look at how much it would take. I'm not sure this is the right way to phrase the question, but for now we'll call it how much would it take to work? How much pay do workers give up to be remote relative to coming on site? So we can look in a couple of different ways at how much additional pay it requires to give up work from home flexibility. And we're going to estimate compensating differentials in two ways. So we're going to compare salary expectations for workers who express preferences for remote work with those who do not. That's going to be self-reported. So workers basically express what they're looking for in terms of salary. And they also express preferences for remote work versus work at home. And so this is essentially like analyzing survey data. But we can also look at the applicant level, sort of the jobs that people are applying to and which ones, if they're applying to work jobs that are both remote and on site, essentially what the pay differential is between those categories of work for workers or job seekers who are applying to both sets of jobs. This is kind of what those analyses say, is that our estimates are suggesting a pay differential of about 6 to 8% for remote work. We kind of like that number because they're pretty close to there's a paper by Mas and Pillay which shows about an 8% salary differential for work from home flexibility, although that's in a call center context, so it's a very different population. There's also, I guess, a more recent paper which puts that number at around 5% for hybrid work. So I feel like these numbers that are the data here are suggesting are very much in the ballpark, although of course they are for a very different population in some ways for high skilled work. So I think interesting to see this number stays fairly consistent in this group. Okay, so this is kind of where we are with this paper. I wanted to leave time for Q&A. I'll mention one more thing though before I wrap up here, and then I'm happy to take any questions and of course comments, suggestions, feedback as well. Before I wrap up this set of results, I just want to mention this is part of a broader effort for us to understand labor markets for tech entrepreneurship. One of the things I haven't talked about here, but which we also have access to, is skills. And so we're interested in this general question, I'll show that picture again in a second, of how startups, firms in general, but startups is what we're looking at right now, how they think about the balance between location, on-site work, remote work, and skills. So where do you put work? Some skills, some jobs have skills that have productivity spillovers, some jobs it doesn't matter. And so how are startups, how are firms thinking about these different decisions? And I'll show you a picture here that I find interesting and that we're trying to move forward with as we extend this work, maybe not in this paper, but in general, is that if we think about like where firms are choosing to post jobs, right? There's been this narrative in the press, at least, about the death of Silicon Valley. And of course, it's probably way too early to talk about that. But the idea is that there is sort of a deconcentration, a spreading out of firms and where where economic activity is post pandemic. So we're looking in this data, and of course, this is very current data. We actually have it being pushed kind of real time. So we have it up until essentially yesterday. So what this picture is showing is a Lorenz curve for remote postings for 3 different years, 2017, 18, and 22. And I don't have labeled which is which, but the point is they're all pretty much the same. And so what this is, you sort of have New York at the top here, San Francisco, Los Angeles. The only reason San Francisco isn't at the top is because San Francisco is actually disaggregated into Mountain View and Palo Alto and other places. San Jose is down here. So it's actually a few different cities. But the idea here is that the concentration of remote postings looks pretty much the same for 2017, 18, and 22. For on-site work, however, things are shifting. So this is 2017, this is 2018. For on-site work, there seems to be a pretty significant deconcentration of on-site jobs that have been posted, at least so far in 2022. So we're trying to think about this in the broader context of if you are a startup and you're thinking about remote work as a tool in your kit, and you're also trying to consider these various factors like skills and where there are where people with specialized skills benefit from being in a specific location, how you think about that in a unified framework. Okay, so turning back to this though, just to wrap up here, again, happy to take any questions, comments, suggestions. So we're finding so far is that turning jobs remote attracts applicants with greater diversity and more experience. We estimate about a 6 to 8% compensating differential for work from home flexibility, slightly lower for URM candidates, slightly more for female candidates. Those numbers I don't have here, but they're in the paper. Again, I just want to caveat this by this is sort of what we're trying to document what is happening in the market, not necessarily a what should be, because we may, if this finding that remote work tends to attract an application pool of a particular type. If remote work may not be a path to the best jobs. Maybe it is, and we don't know enough yet. But we want to learn a little bit more about that before making any prescriptive claims about what this means. And of course, this is a period of pretty significant transformation. Still a lot of dust that needs to settle in the market, and we're looking forward to continuing to track and watch this as it progresses. So thanks very much, and happy at this point to take any kind of questions, comments. David, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Sonny. Appreciate it. This third bullet is kind of where I was going to go, and you may not have an answer to this, but the tech space has certainly been exposed in the last decade for being one of a lack of diversity in almost every way, in terms of general partners at VC funds, limited partners at VC funds, CEOs. Is that the root of this third bullet here, or did you not think of that kind of existential issue? Yeah, so the root of this third bullet's a little bit different. I mean, I think from a framing perspective, we are interested in this particular industry because of the points you made. This industry in particular has struggled, I think, with the challenges you mentioned. The root of this third bullet is a little bit different, which in my mind is saying if the tech industry has also been well known for maybe moving jobs into the contract space or the remote space and then later offshoring them. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, if it's the case that remote jobs attract more female candidates, for instance, that may not be great to segment workers that way. That may be the case, but it may not be great in terms of what we actually want to achieve long term or ultimately. And so that was sort of my caveat there, is that remote jobs may have other, there's productivity, promotion downsides and so on that we need to learn more about. Yeah, Emma?
Yeah, so do you have who gets hired?
No, I think in theory we could probably track some of that down through LinkedIn, and to the question earlier, we do have some name information, but we don't have it directly. It would be a messy data task.
I see.
Yeah,
I was going to say, I would be interested to see if there's also any preference on the employer side for different types of workers. Like, I don't know, maybe if it's not someone you have to work with in the office, you're like, well, I don't care, then I'm going to hire someone really different than me. But if it's someone that I'm going to hire to work next door, maybe I want someone who I think will be able to talk about sports with me or something. So I would be curious if there's like demand side effects along these lines.
So we do have a little bit of information here. We do have the next. We don't have hiring. If you think about hiring as a funnel, right? We don't have the hire, but we do have something in the middle. which is that out of all the applications I got, these 5 are the ones I was most interested in. So that tells us something perhaps about what employers are thinking, but it's not quite the the ultimate decision. Yeah.
And there's no like interviewing feature of the website or inviting or recruiting or something.
I think that's all. I think that's handled off platform.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sonny, I have a question that I think could be interesting if you keep collecting this data, which is like, we have seen adoption of remote work sort of like almost economy-wide for the last 2 years, which is why I think you've seen this sort of dampening effect on your selection, right? But as the remote work sort of wave sort of recedes a little bit and we get this sort of hybrid or going back to the office, do you see sort of its heterogeneous impact on gender? Like that's where the gender effect could come through, where you see this bounce back again of like more URM or female applicants sort of choosing the remote option over the being on-site option versus the non-URM male workers. Could that be something you could track as you get more data on this?
So you want me to see if it's sticky, basically, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the stickiness of
or
this
if,
move. Exactly.
Yeah, or if things go back. No, absolutely. Yeah, no, certainly we have. I mean, this I think what I'm showing you here, I think this is already up until about mid-June. But I was working on something yesterday, which is through September or October actually. So certainly that's trackable to see if this is if this is sticking. And just for I guess a little bit of history here, we originally had written this up with data through like, I don't know, June 2020. And at that point, we started talking about it and people were like, well, we need to see a lot more time pass because, this is just too early, too new. And so I think we already have a little bit more insight than we did before into, 2 years later here, what is the level of stickiness and this kind of firm staying remote and what this means. But I don't think we can certainly look at how this affects the gender and race types of folks. We haven't done that yet.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? We just got a wow in the chat.
Yeah, no, that was me with the on-site
striking.
versus on-site versus remote distribution. That was very striking. Yeah.
The deconcentrate. The other, I will mention, since we have a minute, the other thing I've been looking at, I was looking at yesterday, but I was having trouble with it. I was hoping to be able to show you. I'm curious if the political polarization we're seeing has an effect on applications in terms of where firms are, especially some of the high profile events that have been going on the last year and a half or so. And I think, there's obviously in a tight market like this, workers do have a significant amount of agency in terms of where they're choosing or wanting to work across the country. Things weren't shaking out quite like I expected, and I wasn't sure what I was seeing in the data, so I didn't throw it on a slide today, but I'm interested in that question as well, because you can look at things, for instance, like the Roe v. Wade decision, for instance, and look. I mean, it's very granular data. It's almost to the minute, and so you can start to see exactly what it is. If there is a effect on the application side, on the talent side, you can start to perhaps visualize some of that.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking of another stream where, just a couple of years ago, it was with great fanfare, Amazon was looking for their other headquarters and Boeing moved from Seattle. I'm wondering if the fact that there's more remote work in general, if that's making any difference whatsoever in where a company is headquartered.
No, I think that's a super interesting question. I think that generally this location question for startups has gotten all of a sudden much more difficult than it was maybe a few years ago. Yeah.
There's, I think, another question that I think it would be very interesting long term, and this is conditioned on sort of remote work being a significant part of the economy long term as well. Because I guess right now we've got this whole, tech sectors getting a lot of layoffs. So you have a lot of questions about whether or not remote work now is just an amenity, just like part of the wage equation, right? Like if you have layoffs, that means that people are going to be more willing to accept non-remote work. So hopefully that is just a temporary bleep, and then we'll go back to some kind of higher level of remote work, after layoffs potentially. But if this stays, this phenomenon of remote work in the economy, I think it'd be interesting to see whether or not sort of women who apply and get remote work jobs also stay in these jobs for longer term and gain experience, because there is that sort of literature from Judith Chevalier about like the demand flexibility by women throughout their careers, which impacts their promotion chances, right? Like if they're less flexible, that impacts their ability to become higher management workers.
And I would also love to see that line of work evolve. I mean, I'm hoping it does, but there's the static question, I guess, of remote work jobs as they stand right now. But as firms are making, or employers are making these fixed or these investments in changing remote work and how it looks, what that means for promotion is such a critical question, because right now, at least, it seems like most of the wisdom is if you want to get promoted, you got to come in, right? Or at least that's sort of, and so right. I think that's whether that is also sticky, so to speak, or whether that starts to change as employers make big adjustments, or if they make the adjustments that's not the case anymore. That'd be very interesting to see that documented.
Yeah, I guess like in your data, you're mainly seeing sort of like the initial hire, so you cannot see promotions in a sense, and you have to rely on seeing people switching jobs to get promoted, or some kind of years of experience. And you do have years of experience indicators, so maybe you see a higher number for women across time in remote work jobs with more years of experience. Yeah,
that's right. Now we can see people across. We have 12 years, so we can see them apply to multiple jobs. I think that question is fascinating. I'm not sure this data is the best data to do that. I would love to see it done. I think there are data sets that might be better to see if remote work is leading up the promotion ladder or not. But I would also think that's a critical question to learn more about as we move on in this space.
Yeah, I really wonder if the remote work hinders your ability to climb the ladder is the same for women. My guess is it would be different, because the fact that remote work gives you more flexibility, albeit, you have it's a compensating differential, you take a lower salary. My guess is it maybe will get a bunch of women jobs they otherwise wouldn't have had, and then will, pad their resumes, and assuming that, women have a higher demand for flexibility. I expect those have different effects. I think it'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think so.
With some paper.
Yeah.
Really, really cool line of research, Sonny. Look forward to seeing how it grows and develops. Appreciate your being here. It's great to see you as always. I just want to remind our audience that we do have 3 more seminars coming up on November 22nd, 29th, and December 6th. So if you have the time and interest, I hope that you will join us. Next week is Himabindu Lakkaraju of Harvard Business School. So thank you all for joining us. Sonny, good to see you. Be well.
Thank you all. It's good to see everyone. Feel free to reach out if you have further questions or comments.